Every house in my town locks its doors at exactly 8:08 at night. Not 8, not a quarter past. 8:08, to the minute. Every house, every night, in a wave that moves down the road like something breathing out. I grew up here, and nobody told me. I came back as an adult to bury my grandfather, and on my first night in his house I stood on the porch and heard it for myself. And I learned, over the 8 months that followed, exactly what the locks are for, what walks the streets between the hours, and why the time was set at 8:08 and not a minute later. I am writing this down because the man who taught me the rule is dead, and the woman who taught him is older than the rule itself, and someone is going to inherit this house after me. They will need to know what I know. They will need to know before their first night, not after. My name does not matter for this. What matters is that I was 31 years old when my grandfather passed, that I was the only living relative he had left, and that the small house at the end of Coghill Road came to me along with 2 acres of dry pasture, a barn with no animals in it, and a kitchen drawer full of keys with no labels. I had not lived in Hadley's Reach since I was 9. I remembered it the way most adults remember places they left as children, which is to say, I remembered the wrong things. I remembered the smell of the hardware store and the sound of the bell on the door. I remembered a particular crack in the sidewalk outside the post office. I did not remember the doors. Nobody had told me about the doors. I think now that this was deliberate, that the people who raised me wanted me to have at least one childhood that did not include the knowing. I drove up from the city on a Thursday in early October. The drive is 4.5 hours if you obey the speed limit and 6 if you don't know the back roads. I knew the back roads from childhood, the way you know a song you haven't heard in 20 years, which is to say I knew the chorus and almost none of the verses. I got lost twice and arrived a little after 7 in the evening, when the sky over the ridge was the color of a bruise turning yellow at the edges. Hadley's Reach is not on most maps. It sits in a fold of country between 2 larger towns, neither of which acknowledges it on their welcome signs. The population, the last time anyone counted it for the state, was 411. I think the real number is lower. There is a single main street called Front Street, a feed store, a diner, a gas station that closes at 6, a small Methodist church, an even smaller Baptist one, a volunteer fire station, and a post office that doubles as the town clerk's office on Tuesdays and Thursdays. There are perhaps 120 houses spread out along 6 or 7 streets, and another 40 or so further out on the county roads. That is the entire town. I parked in my grandfather's gravel drive at 7:20. The house was exactly as I remembered it, which surprised me, because most things from childhood look smaller when you come back to them, and this house did not. It looked the same size. The porch light was on, which surprised me too, because the man who would have turned it on had been dead for 9 days. I assumed a neighbor had done it as a kindness. I was correct about that, though I did not yet understand the full reason a porch light in Hadley's Reach is never allowed to go dark. I let myself in with the key the lawyer had mailed me. The house smelled like my grandfather, which is to say it smelled like pipe tobacco and wood smoke and the particular brand of black coffee he drank, the kind that came in a red can with a picture of a man in a hat on it. I stood in the front hall for a long time and did not cry, because I had already done my crying on the drive up, in a rest area outside Millerton, with my forehead against the steering wheel and the engine running. By the time I got to Hadley's Reach, I was empty enough to be practical. I carried in my 2 suitcases. I found the thermostat and turned the heat up to 65. I checked the refrigerator, which a neighbor had clearly cleaned out, and found a covered casserole dish with a note taped to the lid that said, "Heat at 350 for 30 minutes. Welcome home, Maeve." Maeve Dorland had been my grandfather's neighbor for 40 years. She had been a widow for 30 of them. I made a mental note to thank her in the morning. I put the casserole in the oven and set the timer. I went upstairs to the bedroom that had been mine when I visited as a boy, and found it exactly as I had left it at age 9, which was the last time I had slept in this house. The same quilt on the same bed, the same water-stained map of the United States on the wall, a few of my old paperbacks on the shelf. I sat on the edge of the bed for a minute, and then I went back downstairs because I did not want to sit there any longer. At a few minutes before 8, I went out onto the porch with a glass of water. The air had gone cold the way it does in October after the sun is fully down, and the sky had gone from bruise to ink. The porch faced west, looking out over Coghill Road. Across the road and a little to the south was the Dorland house. Further down, where the road curved, I could see the lights of 2 or 3 other houses. Past those, the road dropped into a hollow, and the next houses were not visible until it climbed again on the far side, where I could see the porch lights of perhaps 4 more. I drank my water, and I watched the town settle into evening. I do not know exactly when I noticed it, but at some point, I became aware that I was listening to something. A sound was repeating itself along the road. It was not loud. It was the kind of sound you have to actively notice in order to hear, the way you have to notice the refrigerator hum in your own kitchen. It was the sound of doors closing. Not slamming, closing. The careful kind of closing, where someone pulls a door to and then turns a deadbolt. There is a particular 2-part sound to that. A soft thunk, followed by a heavier clack, and once you learn it, you can hear it from a surprising distance on a still night. I heard it from the Dorland house. A few seconds later, I heard it from the house next to the Dorland house. A few seconds after that, from further down the road. The sound moved along Coghill Road like a wave, from north to south, and then I could hear it more faintly from the streets behind, on Birch and on Linden. The same 2-part sound, again and again, until the whole town had performed it. I looked at my watch. It was 8 minutes past 8. I stood on the porch for another long moment, and the silence that followed the wave was not an ordinary silence. It was the silence of a held breath. I went inside, and I locked my own door, because it seemed like the thing to do. I told myself it was a coincidence. I told myself it was a habit of country people, who go to bed earlier than city people, and who lock up before they settle in for the night. I ate the casserole at the kitchen table with the radio playing low. I went to bed at 10. I did not sleep well, though I could not have told you then what was keeping me awake. The next morning, I walked across the road to thank Maeve Dorland for the casserole. She is a small woman, somewhere between 70 and 85, with the kind of weathered face that doesn't change much once it reaches a certain age. She invited me in for coffee and asked me about the drive and about my work in the city, which she pretended to find more interesting than it was. We talked about my grandfather for a while. She told me he had not suffered, which I appreciated even though I did not know whether to believe her. She told me he had asked her in the last week to make sure I had the keys, not just the house key. All of them. All of them? I said. He was particular about that, she said. He wanted you to have the whole ring, every one. He said you would know what to do with them. I did not know what to do with them. There were perhaps 30 keys on the ring in my kitchen drawer, and only 4 of them were obvious to me. The house, the barn, a small padlock I had not yet identified, a key for the truck out in the shed, which I had not yet started. The rest were unlabeled, and some of them looked older than anything else in the house. I almost asked Maeve about the doors. I almost said, I heard a strange thing last night, around 8. I do not know why I didn't. I think it was because she was looking at me a particular way over the rim of her coffee cup. And I had the sense, the way you sometimes have a sense about a conversation, that if I asked, she would tell me, and I was not ready to be told. I spent the day going through my grandfather's papers. He had been a careful man. There were file boxes in the spare room labeled by year, going back to the 1960s. Bank statements, tax returns, receipts for tractor parts, letters from people I had never heard of. I made piles. I made a list of phone calls I would need to make. I drove into town in the afternoon and introduced myself at the post office, where a woman named Carol Mendel remembered me as a child and seemed genuinely glad to see me, and at the diner, where I ate a grilled cheese and overheard a conversation at the next table about a fence that had blown down in the last storm. Nobody mentioned the doors. Nobody mentioned 808. Nobody had to. Everyone in the diner, I realized as I sat there, was wearing a wristwatch, even the teenagers. In a city, almost no one under 40 wears a wristwatch anymore. In Hadley's Reach, everyone did. At 10 of 8, I was back at the house, sitting on the porch again, this time with a cup of coffee, because I wanted to know if I had imagined it. I had not imagined it. At 8:07, a light went on in the Dorland kitchen, where it had not been on before. At 8:08, exactly, the front door of the Dorland house closed. I heard the deadbolt turn. A second or two later, I heard the same sound from the next house down, and the next, The wave moved south along Coghill Road and rippled outward into the streets behind. I sat very still on the porch and listened to it, the way you might listen to a piece of music you didn't quite understand. The whole thing took maybe 90 seconds. By 8:10, the town was silent in a way it had not been silent a minute earlier. It was not just that the doors were closed. It was that something in the quality of the air had changed. The town was sealed. I went inside. I locked my own door. I did it at 8:11, and I felt as I turned the deadbolt that I was late by 3 full minutes, and that being late mattered. I tried to think about it rationally. Small towns develop habits. Old people go to bed at predictable times. There was a church in town, and perhaps the church bells used to ring at 8, and people had organized their evening around it. I checked the next day. There were 2 churches in Hadley's Reach, and neither of them rang their bells at 8. The Methodist rang at noon on Sundays only. The Baptist did not ring at all anymore, because the bell had cracked in 1994 and the congregation had never raised the money to replace it. The next morning at the diner, I tried a careful experiment. I sat at the counter, and I said, to no one in particular, "Quiet town at night." The waitress, whose name was Ruth, said, "It is." "Everybody goes to bed early," I said. "Most of us," she said. "I notice people lock up around 8, I said, and I watched her face when I said it. She did not stop pouring my coffee. She did not look up. She said, "That's what we do." "Any reason?" I said. She finished pouring my coffee and put the pot back on the burner, and then she looked at me, and she had the same expression Maeve had had the morning before. It was not a hostile expression. It was patient, the way an adult is patient with a child who is asking a question whose answer they will understand better in a year or 2. "Your grandfather always locked up at 8, she said. "You should too." "At 8:08, I said. "At 8:08, she said. "Yes." She walked away to take another order. I drank my coffee. The man on the stool next to me, an older fellow in a feed cap, did not look at me, but he said quietly, almost to himself, "Welcome home." I drove back to the house. I went through my grandfather's papers more carefully. I was no longer looking at tax returns. I was looking for anything that mentioned a time, anything that mentioned a rule, anything that mentioned a door. It took me 3 hours, but I found something. In a file box labeled 1987, in among receipts for fencing wire, and a letter from someone named Halvers about a property line, there was a single sheet of paper typed on a typewriter, unsigned. It was a list of 7 items. The header said in block letters, "House Procedure." I will read it to you the way it was written, because the wording matters. First, lock both doors at 8:08. Front first, back second. Do not vary the order. Second, pull every curtain on the ground floor. Upstairs is optional but recommended, and recommendation becomes requirement after the first knock. Third, do not answer a knock between 8:08 and the first light of morning. There will be knocks. Some will sound like people you know. Fourth, if the porch light goes out on its own, do not turn it back on until daylight. Use the candle in the kitchen drawer. Fifth, the phone may ring. Do not answer numbers you do not recognize. Do not answer numbers you do recognize after 10 o'clock. Sixth, if you hear your own name spoken from the yard, write it down on the pad by the bed and do not respond. Show the pad to a neighbor in the morning. Seventh, the rules apply to every house in Hadley's Reach. They do not apply outside the town line. If you must travel, leave before sundown or arrange to stay the night where you arrive. There was no signature. There was no date beyond the year on the file box. The paper was yellowed, and the typewriter had a worn lowercase e that floated above the line, distinctive enough that I would recognize it again. I read the list 3 times. Then I went and got the kitchen drawer and dumped it out on the table. And yes, there was a candle in it, white, half-burned, in a small brass holder. I had not noticed it the first night. I want to say I dismissed the list. I want to say I told myself it was the eccentricity of an old man who had lived alone too long. I did try to tell myself that for about an hour. But I had already heard the doors close 2 nights in a row, at the same minute, all along the same road, and the list explained that, and nothing else I had thought of explained it. So I stopped trying to dismiss it, and I started preparing. That evening at 8:07 I locked my front door. At 8:08 I locked my back door. I pulled the curtains in the living room and the kitchen. I did not pull the curtains upstairs because the list said it was optional, and there had not yet been a knock, and I wanted to retain some sense that I was choosing what to do rather than only obeying. I sat at the kitchen table with a book and I waited. At 8:41, somebody knocked on my front door. It was a polite knock. 3 taps, evenly spaced. Then a pause. Then 3 more. I did not get up. I did not call out. I sat at the kitchen table and I listened. After perhaps 30 seconds, the knocking stopped. I heard footsteps go down the porch steps. The footsteps were ordinary footsteps, the weight and rhythm of a grown man in boots. They went out into the yard and stopped. And then there was nothing. I waited 5 minutes. I went very quietly to the front window, and I lifted one corner of the curtain, perhaps half an inch, and I looked out. There was no one on the porch. There was no one in the yard. The road was empty. The porch light was on. Across the road, the Dorland house was dark except for one upstairs window, where a light burned behind a drawn shade. As I watched, the shade moved a little. Maeve was awake. Maeve was watching the road too. I let the curtain fall. I went upstairs and I pulled every curtain on the second floor, because the list had been clear about what happened after the first knock. Then I went back to the kitchen. My hands were not steady. I made tea, because the act of boiling water for tea is a thing that demands attention, and I needed an attention task. I sat at the table and I drank the tea, and I did not finish the book. At 11, the phone rang. It was an old landline, the kind with a cord, and it sat on a small table in the front hall. My grandfather had refused to give it up. The ring was loud in a house that had been quiet for hours. I went to it and I looked at the caller ID, which was a small box he had attached to the phone himself, sometime in the early 2000s by the look of it. The display read, "Unknown caller." I did not answer. It rang 7 times and stopped. A minute later it rang again. Unknown. 7 rings. It rang 4 more times over the course of the next half hour. Always 7 rings, always unknown. The 5th time I unplugged the cord from the wall. I went to bed at midnight. I did not sleep well. In the morning the cord was plugged back into the wall. I am certain I had unplugged it. I am certain no one had been in the house. The deadbolts were still set from the inside. The back door was still locked. The windows were latched. The cord was plugged in. I want to be honest about what happened next, because if I am not honest about it, the rest of this will not make sense. I considered leaving. I considered packing my 2 suitcases back into the car and driving to a hotel in Millerton and calling the lawyer and telling him to sell everything as is and never coming back. I sat at the kitchen table for an hour that morning and weighed it. I had a life in the city. I had a job I could go back to. I had no real obligation to Hadley's reach. I did not leave, for 3 reasons. The first was the keys. There were nearly 30 of them on the ring, and my grandfather had wanted me to have all of them, and I did not yet know what most of them opened. It felt wrong to abandon something I had not yet finished receiving. The second was Maeve. When I had walked across the road to thank her for the casserole, she had looked at me a certain way, and I had understood, without her saying so, that she was watching to see if I would stay. Not because she wanted my company, because she wanted to know whether the house at the end of Coghill Road was going to be occupied or empty. It mattered to her. It mattered to her in a way that I did not yet understand, but I could feel the weight of it across the table while she poured coffee, and I knew that if I left, I would be leaving her to something. I did not know what. I knew it mattered. The third reason was the most honest one. I had heard the doors close on 2 consecutive nights, at the same minute, all along the same road, and I wanted to know why. I have always been the kind of person who needs to know. It has not, in my life so far, been an entirely useful trait. I stayed. Over the next 2 weeks, I learned the town the way an adult learns a place, which is different from the way a child learns it. I went to the post office on a Tuesday and met the town clerk, a man named Ellis Cowper, who was about 50 and had been clerk for 19 years. He looked at me carefully when I introduced myself and said, "Halloran's grandson. He told us you'd be coming." "He told you?" I said. "In the spring," he said, "when he knew." I had not known my grandfather had been ill in the spring. The lawyer had told me it was sudden. I asked Ellis what he meant, and Ellis said, "It wasn't sudden for him, just for you." He gave me a folder with various papers in it. Property transfer, tax assessment, A welcome packet of all things, with the phone numbers for the volunteer fire department and the county sheriff's substation in Millerton and the water board. At the back of the folder, on a single sheet of paper, was a list of 7 items. The same list, the same block letter header, house procedure, the same floating lowercase e, drifting above the line in exactly the place it had drifted on the page I had found in the file box from 1987. "This is the same as the one I found in his files," I said, "word for word, from a typewriter that has not been used in 30 years. "It would be," Ellis said. "Everybody has one. We give them to new residents. We don't get many new residents." "What is this?" I said. He looked at me for a long moment. Then he said, "It's how we live here." "Yes, but what is it for?" He folded his hands on the counter. He was a thin man with very clean fingernails and a wedding ring worn smooth from 40 years of turning. He said, "Mr. Halloran, your grandfather was a careful man and he wanted you to have the house. If he wanted you to have the rest, he would have told you. I'm not in the habit of telling people things their family do not want them to know. But you'll confirm the list is real. The list is real, and everybody follows it. Everybody. What happens if you don't?" He looked at me, and his face did not change, but something in his eyes did. He said, "We don't, mostly. Now and again somebody doesn't. We don't talk about those times." I took the folder. I drove home. I sat on the porch in the afternoon sun and I read the list again. And it was the same list, word for word, as the one I had found in the 1987 file, 40 years apart. Same words, same order. The lowercase e on the typewriter floated above the line in exactly the same way, which meant either that the same typewriter had been used, or that someone had copied the original carefully enough to reproduce its flaws. Either possibility unsettled me. Both meant the list was older than I had assumed, and that someone was still maintaining it. I started to keep a notebook. I am not the kind of person who normally keeps a notebook. I bought it at the feed store, a small black hardcover with grid paper. I wrote down the time the doors closed each night, 8:08, every night without exception, in a town of 400 people across 6 streets. I wrote down whether anyone knocked. Someone knocked on 3 nights of the first week, always between 8:40 and 9:30, always 3 taps, then a pause, then 3 more. I wrote down whether the phone rang. The phone rang on 4 nights, always unknown caller, always 7 rings. On the 8th night, the phone rang, and the caller ID said Maeve Dorland. It was 11:17. The list said, "Do not answer numbers you do recognize after 10 o'clock." I did not answer. In the morning, I walked across the road. Maeve was on her porch, sweeping. She looked up when she heard my boots on the gravel. "You called me last night," I said. "No, I didn't," she said. "My caller ID said you did. 11:17. She put the broom against the railing. She came down the steps, and she stood in front of me. And she was a small woman, and I am not a tall man, but she made me feel like I was the one looking up. She said, "Did you answer?" "No." "Good." She picked up the broom again. "Don't if it happens. Don't ever, no matter what it sounds like." "What would it sound like?" "Me," she said. "It would sound like me." She went back to sweeping. After a minute she said, without looking at me, "Your grandfather did once, answered. He told me about it the next morning. He didn't sleep right for a long while after, and he never picked up that phone after 10 o'clock again, not once, not even when I called him myself in an emergency. I learned to walk over instead." "What did he hear?" "He never said. He just said it knew things about him that I didn't know, and I'd known him since he was 52. I went home. I added to my notebook. I wrote, "The phone uses voices. The phone knows the voices. It learns them by listening." By the end of my 3rd week in Hadley's Reach, I had compiled a list of observations that I no longer tried to explain. The doors closed at 8:08, all of them, every night, including the doors of houses I knew to be empty. There were 6 empty houses in town that I had identified. 3 of them had been empty for at least a decade. I had walked past 2 of them at exactly 8:08 and heard the deadbolts turn on the inside. There was no one inside. I checked. I went up to the porch of the old Brennan place on Linden Street one afternoon and looked through the window. And the house was empty, dust on the floor, No furniture, no curtains, no lamp. Nothing. That night I stood across the street at 8:07, and at 8:08, with my own eyes on the door, I heard the deadbolt turn. The knocks did not come every night. I came to understand, by talking very carefully to a few people, that the knocks came most often to houses that had recently received a new resident, and to houses where someone had recently died. My house qualified on both counts. The man at the feed store, whose name was Tom, told me once, very quietly, while ringing up a bag of nails, that the knocks would taper off after about 6 weeks. He said it the way you might tell someone that a rash would clear up if they kept using the ointment. He did not look at me when he said it. The phone calls were less predictable. They came to every house, at intervals, and the list of recognized numbers that called after 10 was longer than I wanted it to be. Over the course of October I had calls from Maeve, from Ellis Cowper, from Ruth at the diner, from a man named Pete Halvers who lived 2 streets over, and whom I had met exactly once, and, on one night that I do not like to think about, from my grandfather. That call came at 1 in the morning on a Saturday in late October. The caller ID said Halloran Ray. It rang 7 times. I sat in the front hall and looked at the phone, and I did not pick it up. And after the 7th ring it stopped, and the silence afterward was the loudest silence I have ever heard in my life. I went into the kitchen, and I poured a glass of whiskey from a bottle my grandfather had kept above the refrigerator, and I drank it standing at the sink, and then I went back into the hall, and I unplugged the phone. In the morning it was plugged back in. By the beginning of November I had identified what most of the keys on the ring opened: the house, the barn, the truck, the padlock on the gate at the back of the pasture, a small metal box in the basement that contained my grandmother's wedding ring and a few documents I had not yet read, a toolbox in the shed, the post office box, number 31, at the town post office. The Methodist church, which surprised me, until I learned that my grandfather had been a deacon for many years and had kept his key. There were still 11 keys I could not identify. I asked Ellis Cowper about them one Tuesday afternoon at the post office. I showed him the ring. He looked at the keys. He picked up one of them, a heavy old brass key with a square head, and he turned it in his fingers. He said, "This one is for the cellar of the old Grange Hall. The hall's been closed 20 years, but the cellar's still locked." "What's in the cellar?" "Nothing you need to see." He went through the keys one by one. He identified 8 of them. The last 3 he set aside and did not name. "Those 3, I said. "Those 3, he said, "are for the doors at the end of Coghill Road. My house is at the end of Coghill Road. Past your house," he said, "after the pavement ends. The road keeps going for about 1.5 miles. There are 3 structures on it. Your grandfather had the keys." "What structures?" He looked at me for a long time. He looked the way people look when they are deciding whether to tell you something. Then he said, "Mr. Halloran, I have been the clerk of this town for 19 years. There are things I know because I am the clerk. There are things I do not know because no one has chosen to tell me. The 3 structures at the end of Coghill Road are in the 2nd category. Your grandfather had the keys. He kept them up. Once a month, I believe, he went out there and he checked on them. I do not know what he checked. I do not know what they contain. I know that the rule about locking the doors at 8:08, and the rule about the curtains, and the rule about the phone, and all the other rules, those rules exist because of what is at the end of that road. That much I have been told. The rest I have not." "Who told you that much?" "My predecessor, when I took the job." "And who told her?" "Her predecessor. We have been the clerks of Hadley's Reach for 141 years. Each of us has been told the same much. None of us has been told more." He pushed the 3 keys back across the counter to me. He said, "If you choose to go out there, do it in daylight. Do not go after 4 in the afternoon, even if you think you have time. Take the keys back with you when you come home. Do not leave anything behind, not a glove, not a button, nothing. And lock your doors at 8:08, like you have been." "Have you ever gone out there?" "No," he said. "Do you want to?" He smiled, and it was the only time I had ever seen him smile, and it was not really a smile. He said, "Mr. Halloran, I am 51 years old. I have been the clerk for 19 years. I will be the clerk for another 15, God willing, and then I will retire, and my successor will hear the same much from me that I heard from my predecessor. I have organized my entire life around not going out there. Please do not ask me again. I left the post office. I waited 2 days. I told myself I was preparing, but really I was working up the nerve. On the third day, a Thursday in the first week of November, I put the 3 keys in my pocket along with the rest of the ring. I dressed warmly because the wind off the ridge had teeth that month. I put a flashlight and a bottle of water and a notebook into a canvas bag, and I walked out the back of my property, through the pasture, to where the gravel of Coghill Road continued past my barn and turned to dirt. The road ran straight for about a quarter mile through a stand of birches, and then it began to climb. It was a logging road by the look of it, though no logging had been done on it in a long time. The trees pressed close. There were no other houses, no driveways, no mailboxes. I walked for maybe 40 minutes. The road curved twice and then opened into a clearing. The first structure was a small stone building, about the size of a single-car garage, with a slate roof and a heavy wooden door bound in iron. There were no windows. It looked like it had been built in the 19th century and had been maintained, not restored. The mortar was fresh in places. The second structure stood about 30 yards beyond the first. It was a wooden shed, much newer, perhaps from the 1950s, painted a dull red that had faded almost to brown. It had a padlock on the door and a small barred window high up on one side. The third structure was further on, almost at the edge of the clearing, where the ground began to slope down toward a creek I could hear but not see. It was the smallest of the 3. It looked like a root cellar, a wooden door set into a low rise of earth with a stone lintel above it. I stood in the clearing for a long time. The wind moved in the birches. There was no other sound, no birds, no traffic from the town, nothing. I had 3 keys and 3 doors. I had decided before I left the house that I would try one, just one, to see. I chose the stone building because it was the oldest, and because if my grandfather had been checking on these things for years, the oldest seemed the most important. The key turned. The lock was well oiled. The door swung inward on hinges that did not creak. Inside it was dim, but not dark. There was a small grate high in the back wall that let in a square of light. The floor was flagstone. The walls were stone. There was no furniture. There was no smell of damp or rot. The air inside was cool and dry, which it should not have been, in a sealed stone room in November. In the exact center of the floor, there was a chair. It was a plain wooden chair, ladderback, the kind of chair you would find in 1,000 kitchens across the county. It was not old and it was not new. It was facing the door. On the chair, folded neatly, was a piece of paper. I do not remember walking across the floor. I remember picking up the paper. I remember unfolding it. It was a single sheet, typewritten, on the same kind of paper as the House procedure list, with the same floating lowercase e. It said, "If you are reading this, you have opened the wrong door first. This is not a fault, only a delay. The order is red, root, stone. Lock this door behind you. Do not return to it before the other 2 have been opened in order on separate days. Do not sit in the chair. The chair is not for sitting. The chair is for being seen from. Signed R.H. R.H. were my grandfather's initials. I folded the paper. I put it in my pocket. I backed out of the stone building. I locked the door. I did not look at the chair again, but I had the distinct sense, as I pulled the door closed, that something on the other side of the room had turned its head. I walked back to town. I did not stop. I did not look behind me. When I got home, it was 3:15 in the afternoon, and I sat at the kitchen table for an hour without taking off my coat. That night I locked my doors at 8:07, a minute early, and I pulled every curtain in the house, upstairs and down, without thinking about it. The list had become a reflex. For the next week, I did not go back to the clearing. I went through my grandfather's papers a 3rd time, more carefully than before, looking for anything that referenced the 3 structures, the order, the chair. I found nothing. He had been a careful man, and he had kept the most important things out of his files entirely. What he wanted me to know, he had wanted me to find by walking. On the 8th day, I went back. It was a Friday, clear and cold. I left the house at 10 in the morning. I went to the red shed first because that was the order. The padlock opened with the second of the 3 keys. The door swung outward. Inside, the shed contained a single object, A wooden box, about the size of a child's coffin, on a low trestle. The box was closed. There was no lid latch, no hinges visible. It was simply a sealed wooden box. There was a tag tied to one end of it with twine. The tag was old. The handwriting on it was my grandfather's. It said, "Do not open. Do not move. Do not speak to it. Confirm presence. Lock door. Leave." I confirmed the presence of the box. I did not touch it. I did not speak. I locked the door. I left. I went to the root cellar next. The third key turned in the lock. The door opened inward. There were 3 steps down into a small earthen chamber. The walls were lined with stone. There were no shelves. There was nothing on the floor. The chamber was empty. Except, in the back wall, at about chest height, there was a small square opening, perhaps 8 inches on a side. It looked like the kind of opening you might find in an old confessional or in a stable for passing feed through. It went into the earth. I could not see what was on the other side. I leaned close, but I did not put my face to it. I held up my flashlight and I shone it through, and on the far side of the opening, perhaps a foot away, was another wall, and in that wall was a small wooden shutter, closed. I did not try to open the shutter. There was no key for it on the ring, and I understood, in the way you understand certain things without being told, that the shutter was meant to be opened from the other side. I stood in the root cellar for perhaps 30 seconds. I could hear nothing from beyond the opening. But I had the same sense I had had at the stone building, the sense that something on the other side of a wall had become aware of me. I left the root cellar, I locked the door, I walked back to town. That evening at 8:07, I locked my front door. At 8:08, I locked my back door. I pulled every curtain on every floor. I sat in the kitchen with the notebook open in front of me, and I wrote down what I had found, and I tried to understand the system. The way I understand it now, after 8 months in Hadley's reach, is this. I will write it down because somebody else may inherit this house one day, the way I inherited it, and they will need to know. There is something at the end of Coghill Road. I do not know what it is, and I have come to believe that nobody alive knows what it is, including me, including the clerks who have kept the records for 141 years. It was here before the town was here. It is held in place by an arrangement which the town inherited along with the land. The 3 structures are part of the arrangement: the stone building where the chair is, the red shed where the box sits, the root cellar where the small shuttered opening waits. Each, I believe, is a kind of seal. Each must be visited in the correct order at intervals I have not yet fully worked out by whoever holds my grandfather's keys. Each must be checked but not disturbed. The rule about the doors is part of the same arrangement. At 8:08, every night, something is allowed to move through the town. I do not know what. I have not seen it and I do not intend to. The locks do not stop it from moving through the streets. The locks define what is inside and what is outside. As long as every door in town is locked at 8:08, the thing is required to remain outside every door. If a door is open, even one, the arrangement does not hold for that night, and the thing is permitted in. The knocks are it, or something that travels with it, testing. The phone calls are it, or something that travels with it, learning voices. The voices of the dead when they come are because it has been listening to the town for longer than any of us has been alive, and it has the voices of everyone the town has lost. It is patient. It does not knock at every door every night. It does not call every number. It has, as far as I can tell, all the time in the world. I learned later from Maeve that there had been a night in 1962 when a man on Birch Street, drunk, had left his front door open. He had been alone in the house. In the morning, the door was still open, and the man was gone. The house was found exactly as he had left it, the television on, a glass of beer half finished on the arm of his chair. He was never found. The town had a service for him 3 years later, when the state declared him dead. After that, the rule about the doors was tightened, and the time was fixed at 8:08, because someone, my grandfather's predecessor I think, had determined that this was the latest minute that was safe. I do not know why 8:08. I have asked. Nobody knows. The time was set before any of the living were born. I have been to the 3 structures 8 times now. I do them in the correct order. Red, root, stone. I go once a month in daylight, never after 4. I confirm the box, I confirm the empty cellar. I enter the stone building briefly, and I look at the chair from the doorway, but I never sit in it, and I never go further into the room than I have to. I leave a small offering on the floor in front of the chair. A coin, a button, a folded piece of paper with my name written on it. I do not know if these are required. My grandfather did not leave instructions for them. I have come to believe by instinct that they help. The chair has not moved. The box has not opened. The shutter behind the small square opening has not been raised. Last week I received a call at 11:40 at night. The caller ID said my own name, Halloran, and then my given name, the one I've used since childhood. The call came from my own number. I did not answer. In the morning I checked my phone records, and there was no outgoing call from my line at that time. It is learning me. I think, eventually, it will have my voice perfectly, the way it has my grandfather's, the way it has Maeve's, the way it has the voices of everyone in this town who has lived here long enough to be listened to. And when it has my voice, it will call the house at the end of Coghill Road one night, when I am old, or one night after I am gone, and someone else will be sitting in this kitchen, perhaps a cousin's child I have not met yet, perhaps a stranger who bought the place at auction because I had no one to leave it to, and the phone will ring, and the caller ID will say my name, and that person will have to decide whether to answer. I hope they have read this. That is the reason I am writing it. The folder sits in the bottom drawer of my grandfather's desk now, the same desk where I found the first list, in the box marked 1987. I have added the house procedure page, and a copy of the note from the stone building, and a hand-drawn map of the clearing, and a description of the 3 structures and the order in which they must be opened, and a list of every recognized voice that has ever called my phone after 10. I have left the candle in the kitchen drawer where my grandfather left it. I have left the keys on the ring, all 30 of them, hanging on a hook beside the back door. I lock my front door at 8:07. I lock my back door at 8:08. I pull every curtain. I do not answer the phone after 10. When I hear the knocking, which still comes about once a week, I sit in the kitchen with the radio playing low, and I drink tea, and I wait for it to stop. It always stops. Tonight is the first Tuesday in June. The wind is soft in the birches behind the barn. The sun has just gone down. Across the road the light is on in Maeve's kitchen, and I can see her shadow moving behind the curtain, and I know that at 8:07 her shadow will go still. And a moment later I will hear her front door close, and then her deadbolt, and then the deadbolt of the house next to hers. And the wave will move down the road, the way it has moved down the road, every night since before I was born. I will lock my own door at 8:08, exactly. I will pull my curtains. I will sit at the kitchen table with my notebook open and a cup of tea cooling beside me, and I will listen, and I will write down whatever I hear. In the kitchen drawer, beside the matches, the candle waits. It is half burned. My grandfather lit it once, and never told me when, and never told me why. The wick is black. The wax has run down one side and pooled at the base of the holder, and dried there, the shape of it a small frozen wave. I have not had to light it yet. The porch light is on. The doors are locked. The wave is coming down the road. It is 8:08.